Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to welcome you to Spotlight on the NGV Collection, an online event series designed exclusively for NGV Foundation members, Felton Society members, as well as supporters and friends of the NGV. Through this series, generously supported by the Spotlight Foundation, we will explore unique aspects of the NGV collection, highlighting little-known areas and exploring stories behind familiar favourites. My name is Cara Becker and I'm the Projects and Communications Manager of Fundraising at the NGV. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Before we get started, I have some quick housekeeping notes for everyone joining us. We want you to feel involved today, and if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function to the right of our video. A member of the NGV team will be live and responding to your questions this afternoon. To post a question, you need to sign into a Gmail or Google account. Just click on the sign-in link in the upper right-hand corner of the page and follow the prompts. So thank you again for joining us for this online discussion exclusively for NGV supporters. This afternoon, we are delighted to welcome you to our late 19th and early 20th century Paintings and Decorative Arts Gallery on Level 2 here at NGV International. Today, we'll be focusing on a rare opportunity to acquire a remarkable hand-stitched quilt by Martha Pettway, one of the most important quilters of Gee's Bend in Alabama. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Katie Somerville, our Senior Curator of Fashion and Textiles, and Danny Whitfield, our Curator of Fashion and Textiles, who will also introduce a very special guest joining us today, Raina Lampkins-Fielder. Katie and Danny, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Cara. We're delighted to have Raina Lampkins-Fielder joining us today from Paris to share her expertise. Hello, Raina.
Hello, how are you? Greetings from Paris.
Raina is a Paris-based curator and cultural programmer. She currently serves as curator for the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, the Atlanta-based non-profit that documents, preserves and showcases art by African-American artists of the American South. The foundation manages the Souls Grown Deep collection, which represents over 160 artists. Hers is a distinguished career, working for over 20 years in museums and cultural institutions, including the Whitney Museum, Brooklyn Museum, the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, and the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we are thrilled to have her join us today. I'd now like to invite Raina to provide us with a background into the Souls Grown Deep Foundation and the important work that she undertakes in her role there. Thank you, Raina.
Thank you both for inviting me. I'm delighted to be with you all and to speak with you about the quilt making tradition of Gee's Bend, Alabama, and the beautiful housetop quilt made by esteemed Gee's Bend quilt maker Martha Pettway, as well as to introduce you to the work that we do at Souls Grown Deep. As was mentioned, I am the curator of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which is based in the U.S. with our headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, but we have offices in New York and Paris where I'm based. And so that really allows for us to spread the legacy of the artists more broadly. The Souls Grown Deep Foundation was actually founded in 2010, but traces its roots to the mid-1980s when the artworks of relatively ignored African-American artists in the southeast of the United States really came to light, due in large part to the efforts made by collector and writer Bill Arnett, who had amassed a really rather impressive quantity of work from artists in the South. This then led to our founding in 2010 when his collection of over 1,300 museum quality artworks were bequeathed to a charitable art foundation. And so with that, the Souls Grown Deep Foundation was born. Many people ask us about our name, Souls Grown Deep. Our name comes from the last line of the poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. And that line reads, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers." All of our artists lived and worked in the Deep South, and roughly geographically that stretches from Florida to the Texas Panhandle, with the majority of them in the traditional so-called Black Belt of Alabama and Mississippi. And their work is often informed by, that sense of place. To me, it really is a strength, this regional diversity, which is shown through the work of those continuing to find inspiration there. It has its own sensibility, as we see in the quilt, certainly from Gee's Bend. As was mentioned, the mission of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation is to document, preserve, and promote the work of Black artists from the American South, and to encourage the inclusion of their artistic production and cultural traditions in the American art canon and the canon of art history writ large. And we accomplish this through mounting and supporting exhibitions, educational programs, publications, the Souls Grown Deep internship program for undergraduate students of color, and of course our collection transfer program, where museums like NGV can acquire artwork for their permanent collections from our collection of works, as was mentioned, by 160 African American artists. And it's important to note that 2/3 of these artists are women. Since 2014, our artists are now represented in the permanent collections of over 24 American museums, and increasingly museums in other parts of the world. And these museums include the Metropolitan in New York, MFA Boston, the Smithsonian, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Baltimore Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the High Museum in Atlanta, bringing it back to our hometown. And also, most recently, the National Gallery of Art in the United States made a significant acquisition. And just a few days ago, Apollo magazine, which is a London-based publication, confers awards for the most significant museum acquisitions of the year. And one of the 8 acquisitions that was identified worldwide was the acquisition made by the National Gallery of Art of 40 artists from our collection. So it was really quite significant. Obviously, we have been expanding our reach to expose these artists internationally, the work and ideas of these artists, of the women from Gee's Bend. They're really not bound by race or nationality or borders, and are really globally relevant and significant. So we are delighted that this exceptional historical housetop quilt by Martha Pettway is being shown here in Australia. And this is the quilt's maiden voyage across the waters to Australia. So it's its first showing and potential acquisition of a Gee's Bend quilt in Australia. So it's a really important moment. And I do feel that, textile traditions and textile artistry seems to be something that binds us globally as people. And, so often, obviously, for the utilitarian purposes of the work, but also for their beauty. Of the 160 artists in our collection, a significant number of them are the quilt artists hailing from Boykin, Alabama, with the community of Gee's Bend being its artistic epicenter, one could say. Now, the women of Gee's Bend have created hundreds of quilt masterpieces dating from the early 20th century to the present. Resembling an inland island, Gee's Bend is surrounded on 3 sides by the Alabama River. So it really has maintained a certain sort of isolation, which has contributed to the consistency of the tradition being passed on there, this quilt making tradition. The 700 or so inhabitants of this small rural Black community are mostly descendants of enslaved Africans. And for generations, they worked the fields belonging to the local Pettway plantation. And obviously, Martha Pettway, we hear from her surname, there is that relation there. And for those of us who are familiar with some of the quilt makers from Gee's Bend, it is impossible to not notice that the surname Pettway is one of the names that predominates there to this very day. Quilt makers have been producing work there beginning as far back as the mid-19th century, with the oldest existing examples dating from the 1920s that we have. In 1937, photographer Arthur Rothstein, who was taking essentially survey photos of the tenant farmers in Boykin, Alabama, captured images of quilts hung outside being aired. And this is the tradition of the airing of the quilts. And this continues also in Gee's Bend in May. And this is where you hang the quilts outside on wire clotheslines, draping them over fences or on top of wood piles. And in this way, after cleaning them or beating them, you can they kind of can dry in the sun. Now, Rothstein's photographs of the people and their homes and the extraordinary quilt works that he saw that the women created when he was taking these photos really was a revelation when they were taken. And they were taken for the Farm Security Administration. So it was, almost a happy accident that he chanced upon these works being shown. And then it was later published in the book documenting America, 1935 to 1943. So then a national audience really was exposed to this novel approach to American quilt making and introduced to the unique, isolated community that founded this tradition. And then through these images, the wider public was also afforded a rare glimpse into the homes of the community, where these domestic works of art were primarily on display on beds or lining walls against the bitterly cold winters in unheated homes in this area. Now, this rich contemporary African American visual art traditions from the South, which were very much developed outside of the formal structure of schools and galleries and museums, really offer a powerful insight and fresh perspectives into some of the most compelling political and societal issues of our time. And in so many ways in the work that is expressed not only through subject or theme or content, but also through the materials used themselves. It really tells us quite a bit about the time in which the artists were living. And we very much see that in the work coming from Gee's Bend. And one could really easily maintain that the work that's made by these artists in our collection represents a missing chapter in American art history. And that's really what we do at the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. We really work to redress that void in partnership with museums who are likewise forward-thinking and wanting to be as curious and as truthful and as honest about telling the story of art as they can be. And the quilts themselves are really astounding creations, which are enlivened by a visual imagination that extends the expressive boundaries of the quilt genre, very much so, and really constitute a crucial moment, a movement in the history of American art.
Thank you, Raina. That was fantastic. Really terrific background for us. But now Danny and I are going to take advantage of having you with us and ask you some more questions to learn more specifically about Martha Pettway and also the housetop variation quilt from the 1930s that we're interested in hearing about. So Martha was a prominent quilt maker and figure in the Gee's Bend community at the beginning of the 20th century. What can you tell us about her? When did she start quilting? How did she learn to quilt? And anything you can about this particular quilt that she made?
Sure. Well, Martha Pettway was born in 1911 in an area called the White's Quarters, and that's an area of Gee's Bend. And of the four neighborhoods in Gee's Bend, which were Pettway, Sodom, Brown's Quarters, and White's Quarters, White's was the most removed from the center, and the center was defined as being around the old Pettway plantation house. And really, she resided in the area that was the most rural, in what is, admittedly a pretty rural area in Alabama. So there were lots of woods and very few houses. Like most of the quilt artists from Gee's Bend and Rehoboth, one started to quilt as a child. learning from mothers and grandmothers, aunts, cousins, neighbors. Very much knowledge was passed down to her from previous generations of quilters in the community. And even today, when people talk about Gee's Bend and talk about the Gee's Bend community, it is as if one is speaking about a family. So again, the idea of family, community, neighbor, friend, it's all a bit mixed into sort of one whole. And so in a way, when one learns how to quilt, one's learning from the community as a whole. And, you know, in a sense, this consistent transference of knowledge really can be, to my mind, seen as an alternative academy that has nourished over a century of talented quilt makers, with porches and kitchens acting in place of traditional studios and formal lecture halls. And Martha Pettway's son, the Reverend Curtis Pettway, she had 11 children, recalls that his mother was constantly making quilts and clothing, and that she spent also a great deal of time quilting with her best friends, Clementine Kennedy and Pearlie Kennedy Pettway. And now these women's works, especially Clementine's work and her housetop, really kind of hints, in her workings with the housetop pattern, really kind of hints at the many circles of stylistic interchange within which the tradition really developed, particularly in the early parts of the 20th century. Martha's most prolific and important period of quilt making coincided very much with her childbearing years. So the late 1920s to, you know, the very early 1940s. And so this housetop quilt is an example from that period, after she had really gotten a bit serious after a few years. And so it resides right within that important period of time in her quilt making. Unlike most other quilt makers in the area at the time, she really carefully protected and preserved her favorite quilts. You know, and of that, only a dozen or so of some of these earliest quilts, which this housetop is one. She was really one of the most technically polished quilt makers of her era. And I think that her interest in conserving her work is really exemplative of the fact that there was an artist's mind behind this seemingly utilitarian object. You know, she had created something visually interesting and unique that represented moments in her life. And she deemed that important to preserve. You know, she was conscious of her artistry and the desire for her work to last, in a way as all good artists do.
Thank you, Raina. What a fascinating insight into the production of her artwork, but also into her own, I guess, sort of personal ambition for her quilt making. I think it'd be really interesting now to talk about the particular design of this housetop variation. I mean, as we know, there are particular quilting traditions associated with particular places or communities or historic moments. In the NGV collection, we have Victorian era tumbling block quilts, crazy patchworks. We have a suite of Amish quilt designs. But really, Gee's Bend is known for a particular or a unique individualistic approach to quilt making that is about a geometric simplicity and this improvisational pattern work. So can you tell us a little bit more about the housetop variation?
Sure. Well, first, I have to begin with, I think one of the things that really distinguishes Gee's Bend is that while, yes, there are quilt patterns that are familiar and communities that have been continuing traditions, it is unusual to find a place that has so consistently made such visually impactful and idiosyncratic quilts of such high quality from family to family, from a really small pocket of earth relatively on this planet. And so that's something that I really do find so extraordinary and is always kind of important for me, and I think for all of us to remember and consider. It's a style that is so very much tied to a very specific place on this planet, and there isn't, and it's not so huge. But let's talk about some of the patterns, and particularly the housetop quilt. The fundamental geometries of Gee's Bend quilts really shine in works made with single repeating patches, triangles, squares, diamonds, and hexagons. And these forms, like what one would see in the work clothes quilt genre, really offer metaphors for existence in the Bend, where art really discovered ways to sprout from the ordinariness of daily life. As a category, quilts dominated by a single shape really express themselves almost magically in their repetition and in their mutations and variations on themes. Most Gee's Bend quilts can be called improvisational or my way quilts, and this is a term that many people in the Bend use. And so the quilter starts with basic forms and then heads off their way, allowing the material to direct their hand with unexpected patterns, unusual colors, really surprising rhythms. There's something, there could be a quilt that feels like it's a very specific like poem, and then another one that feels much more musical in nature. It really is allowed to surprise us in this way, even within what might be considered a rigid form. Now, the quilt makers of Gee's Bend tell similar stories when describing their separate styles. Taken together, the women's insistence on developing a unique artistic voice really becomes a statement about their community's tradition. The people of the Bend like to do things in a certain way, and they've stuck to them, and it's worked, obviously. So this kind of shared almost rebelliousness, this kind of unorthodoxy really attests to the stabilizing power of a tradition that really for generations fostered this individualism and even eccentricity in the creation of these quilts. So by making what they wanted to make, they really were kind of allowed to reveal innovative ways of looking at fabric, design, and format. And that ends up having resonances even now, which perhaps we can talk about later. Like many artists in the Bend, Martha Pettway's preferred pattern was the housetop. The housetop is the pattern that reigns supreme. And she would repeat this this can be repeated in numerous variations because its simplicity really allowed for endless compositional flexibility. She also rethought the conventional design of the housetop to create some of the most superb early versions that we have yet to have found. People in the Bend refer to any quilt dominated by concentric squares as a housetop. Conceived broadly, the housetop is more of an approach toward form and construction than a strict pattern. So to reiterate, though, one is not bound by any categories and in the Bend. And an artist can blend several patterns, such as housetop and, as you had mentioned, Danielle, log cabin. And in Gee's Bend, interestingly, log cabin is sometimes called bricklayer. So even for some of the patterns that we might know, there are regional community names for that have more of a specific resonance to just the working and the time of the people then and there. So by breaking and blending these patterns, designs then are really filled with action and vibrancy and something that's kind of surprising about them. And they're given very much a new life. Even kind of dominant patterns are allowed to be given a new life. Now, the housetop, from the composite block down to its constituent pieces, really echoes the right angles of the quilt's borders. And this kind of initiates these visual exchanges between the work's edges and then what is inside. And having this kind of back and forth, this intrinsic push and pull, almost like a call and response among elements, is something that was very interesting to, and continues to be interesting to, quilt artists from Gee's Bend. This kind of visual feedback that's offered in the work. And And for the housetop, it begins with a medallion of solid cloth or one of like an endless number of pieced motifs, as we see in this quilt, to anchor the quilt. And then after that, housetops all share the technique of joining rectangular strips of cloth so that the end of a strip's long side connects to one short side of a neighboring strip. And then eventually it forms a kind of frame surrounding the central patch. Increasingly larger frames or borders are added until a block is declared complete.
Incredible. And also the material language of the quilt is also important. We think about, particularly in the early 20th century, Gee's Bend quilts were made out of salvaged materials, so often fabric remnants, old clothing, work clothes, denims. This example by Martha Pettway has an assortment of cotton fabrics, I think rice and fertiliser bags. Can you talk a little bit about the actual fabric or the material language?
Sure. And that's something that's in some ways, very specific to Gee's Bend. Artists really are kind of gifted at transformation, regardless of the materials that they're using, and they're interesting. One of the things that is very specific to Gee's Bend and specific to this work is, really finding the poetic in unusual raw material that could just be sort of trash, the cast-off bits, the sort of flotsam and jetsam of daily life that we all see, but then we don't really see. And so these artists really kind of offer a rebuke to, our lack of imagination, So the tradition, in general of the patchwork quilt arose in times and places where the shortages of cloth called for the inventive salvaging of fabric scraps and remnants. And in Gee's Bend, this recycling practice, which was absolutely out of necessity. Gee's Bend, even today, though things are changing, has been an area that has not had a lot. And so that has not had a lot of means. Alabama is not a wealthy state, and Wilcox County, the county seat in which Gee's Bend sits, is within a poor state, one of the poorest counties. So there has never been a lot there. There's nothing to spare in Gee's Bend. And so this recycling practice kind of is just part of life, but it also became the founding ethos for generations of quilt makers who've transformed these otherwise useless materials into these marvels. And until the middle of the 20th century, the majority of quilts from the area were made from worn out work clothes, from faded denim pockets, dress bottoms, aprons, if they were stained or torn, anything that made them useless for original purposes, as well as those objects like flour sacks, sugar sacks, fertilizer bags, rice bags, all of these fabrics which also represented one's domestic life, your cooking or your farming labor. All of these items outside of beyond their use as fabric, some sort of textile, they also really provide a tangible record of lives lived. And so there's something really profoundly autobiographical about them, that the ancestors are still there to keep you warm. And there are moments when, someone can identify a dress that they wore when they were 6 years old going to school, and there's like a little fragment of that pink that is recognizable. So it's always kind of tying family and community back together and displaying it in a very different way. One of the things that's very interesting about the materials that you find is that they can often, specify a moment in the history of Gee's Bend and sort of provide a larger context. So for instance, when you find corduroy, remnants of corduroy in a work, that comes from a certain period from the late 60s to the early 70s when Sears had commissioned many of the quilt makers through the Freedom Quilting Bee to create pillow cushions. So the scraps were taken home and then used in new ways, because also corduroy, which is quite a challenging material with which to quilt, this was new in the area. So this kind of provided another source of inspiration and improvisation to these artists. And, ultimately it speaks very much to, the fact that African Americans have had to make do so often with what we have, having been historically denied so much. So inventiveness and ingenuity, spicing the worst cut of meat with the best spices, breaking new ground is really part of that African American sensibility as we see it manifested in the quilts. And I guess sort of going back to this idea of community and the context within which the works were created, which also is how material was shared and the story that the material tells. It's really hard to think of a quilt in isolation. The foundation of the work, like the original reason for being of a quilt, is for it to be used by someone. So at the outset, family or community or someone outside of yourself is being considered. So quilts could be made to celebrate a birth or a marriage, with fragments from the past integrated into, say, that new future of a couple or the new life of a child. For Martha Pettway, like for most of the women in the Bend, quilt making really was a family and, by extension, a community, or at least a communal affair. So, one imagines Martha quilting with her good friends, Clementine and Pearlie. And then Clementine then quilting, taking some of those ideas and helping, each is helping each other, taking ideas to her three sisters who they would quilt with. And so it all became more of an environment where the children also would help by threading needles, gathering materials, or sewing patches, and so in that way, the artistic traditions were continued and passed on to future generations in a way that was entirely embedded into the everyday function of the community. And in a way, these fragments of material is part of what is in the landscape of the community, which also includes your friends or your relatives. And so all of these things are put into use in these works in a really remarkable way. And this tradition of recycling materials, while it was very necessary up to the middle of the century, it still is so much part of what is done that really does continue.
Raina, that's a really nice link, thinking about the here and now. One quick question, I'm interested about the place of quilt making in the community now, as opposed to the period where Martha was creating her quilts.
Well, the quilt making tradition is alive and well in Gee's Bend. That has never stopped. And in fact, with our collection of quilts, it goes from, sort of the late 1920s through 2012. And there are still quilts being made in that particular, slightly difficult to define Gee's Bend style. But no, it's very much still part of the culture in every way. And also, Gee's Bend is a real place. It's with real people. And sometimes, things can almost feel fossilized in a time or in a place. But no, it's working and creating. And in some ways, there are kind of new movements to look back at historically what was being done, but also to look towards the future.
Raina, I'm interested, talking about things continuing, but one thing that is new, I guess, for Gee's Bend and the community there is the number of significant exhibitions and publications, books that in recent years have focused on these incredible artists and their quilts and the community. So I'm interested in your perspective on how that's shifted people's understanding of these works more broadly.
Yeah. Well, in a way, one of the real questions is, how has the community itself impacted the art world in museums? Because that's kind of allowed for this communication to take place. It has certainly impacted the community by the recognition and the acclaim that the quilt artists have received. Finally, it's like every couple of decades, someone photographs them in 1937. Someone's interested in them in 1960. But having it stick in a certain way, I think it's right. It is now that's really beginning to take root, and not only through the exhibitions and the books and the press, but also through some of the collaborations with other artists and designers that is happening now. For instance, an exhibition just opened at the Met's Costume Institute in New York City called In America, a Lexicon of Fashion. And the exhibition uses the organizing principle of a patchwork quilt. The idea serves as a metaphor for the United States and its varied cultural identities. I'd like to think that perhaps the quilt makers had something to do with just that idea, but also the exhibition, which runs until September of 2022, includes a new collaboration between designer Greg Lauren and quilt artists from Gee's Bend. And also the work and their artistic processes really are increasingly being acknowledged as influential in the work of other contemporary artists like Sanford Biggers, Biza Butler, Diedrich Brackens, Carrie Mae Weems, all have referenced Gee's Bend. And even the dress that was worn by Michelle Obama in her official portrait that was painted by Amy Sherald. Amy Sherald visited the Bend, and the patterns that are on Michelle Obama's dress actually are Gee's Bend patterns. So there's been an impact certainly on the community, but also an impact outside of the community by the quilt makers themselves. But it's true, there are several exhibitions that prove to be seminal moments in the ascension of these artists. Certainly the Quilts of Gee's Bend exhibition in 2002 is one. And more recently, We Will Walk, Art and Resistance in the American South, which was at Turner Contemporary in England last year, introduced British audiences to the quilt makers. And it's safe to say, however, that the Met's 2018 exhibition, History Refused to Die, Highlights from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, proved to be a watershed moment for the artists and the foundation, serving as a fitting entree into the art world. And Roberta Smith is the chief art critic of the New York Times. She reviewed the show, and the headline was, "At the Met, a riveting testament to those once neglected." And that really took us back to a review that Michael Kimmelman had done also for the New York Times in 2002, when the Whitney staged the Quilts of Gee's Bend exhibition. And that's where things really kind of exploded. And Kimmelman referred to the quilts as, quote, "some of the most spectacular works of modern art produced in America." I had the privilege of working with that show. I was at the Whitney at the time. And the president of Souls Grown Deep, Maxwell Anderson, was the director of the Whitney then. And it was he who brought the exhibition to New York. So I really feel that, ultimately the work coming from this small community in Alabama has really expanded and enriched, sort of deepened our collective knowledge about American artistic practice. We've discovered, we've discovered for ourselves new things, works that were already there and already kind of having some sort of resonance.
Thank you, Raina. I was going to ask you what you hope is really the outcome of these quilts being located in different museums internationally. But I feel like you've maybe already answered some of that. But is there anything perhaps that you would add to what you've said?
Well, yeah, it's kind of simple. In many ways, it's about sharing the love on a worldwide scale. We could have constructed a brick and mortar museum to show the collection. But that would require the world coming to us. And we would rather have the work find new homes and new audiences around the world so that the largest and most diverse public has access to it. That's fair. And to find also those local connections to these artists' work, because, what they're saying is for all of us. And, what we feel what these artists have to say is that important. It's too important, too crucial to the history of art to keep it all to ourselves, But, museums are some of the, as we know, are some of the primary caretakers of art. And so it is with and in, our museums that the work can receive the care that it deserves. So it's almost as if it's a little collaboration between the foundation and museums globally in ensuring the preservation and the presentation of this work for generations to come.
Thank you, Raina. That was a lovely summation of, I guess, both the ambitions of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation and also of the NGV. That reflection really brings us very neatly back to the NGV and our own ambition to bring the work of one of the most significant quilters of Gee's Bend into the collection. This is a truly incredible early work, and it really offers us an opportunity to place the unique and rich textile traditions of Gee's Bend within a broader trajectory of 20th century American art practices and also within international textile movements. Housetop Variation by Martha Pettway is a powerfully symbolic acquisition in that it highlights the NGV's own commitment to addressing and dispelling those historical hierarchies within the canon of art history, but it is also an extraordinarily dynamic and beautiful work that will animate our walls and prompt us to reflect on the conditions of art making, past, present, and well into the future. Thank you, everyone.
Raina, Katie and Danny, thank you for sharing with us the story of Martha Pettway and this wonderful quilt. As the first Gee's Bend quilt to enter an Australian public collection, the opportunity to acquire this for the NGV is truly remarkable, and we hope you may be able to make a contribution to make this possible. I wish to recognise and thank those who have already donated towards this appeal, acknowledged on the event webpage today, and those who have made leadership contributions, including Chris and Dawn Fleischner. Thank you. I also wish to thank all the team behind the scenes who produced this online session. We hope you enjoyed today's talk, and we look forward to seeing you at our next online event, to be announced soon. Do stay tuned for further information. In the meantime, have a lovely evening, and from everyone at the NGV, we thank you for your support towards the gallery.